The fluorescent lights of the Chrysalis Tech server room hummed with a nervous energy, a stark contrast to the deathly silence that had fallen over our team. My name is Sarah, and for the past 3 years, this place, this project, Aethelred, had been my life. It wasn't just a job, it was a mission. Aethelred was our groundbreaking AI, designed to analyze vast amounts of medical data, detect the faintest markers of disease years before symptoms appeared, and potentially save millions of lives. We weren't just building software, we were building hope from the start. The Aethelred project had been different. Our CEO, a man named Henderson with a quiet intensity that could move mountains, had put it simply, we're not chasing profits, we're chasing a legacy of health. That ethos filtered down to every one of us. We were a diverse bunch, brilliant minds from every corner of the globe, each drawn by the sheer audacity of Aethelred's promise. There was Dr. Anya Sharma, our lead data scientist, whose mind was a labyrinth of algorithms and statistics, yet who always had a warm smile and a calming presence. There was Mark, a hardware genius who could troubleshoot a motherboard blindfolded, fueled by an endless supply of stale coffee and sarcastic remarks. And then there was me, Sarah, a software architect, the one responsible for the intricate dance of code that would make Aethelred's brain truly think. We poured our lives into it. Weekends blurred into weekdays. Late nights became the norm, illuminated by the glow of monitors and the steam from forgotten coffee cups. We ate meals together, shared bad jokes, celebrated tiny victories with loud cheers, and commiserated over setbacks with grunts and shared sighs. Our families often saw less of us than our keyboards did, but they understood. They knew we were doing something important. My own apartment became little more than a place to sleep, and sometimes not even that. I remember falling asleep under my desk more times than I could count, curled up with a half-eaten protein bar, only to wake up an hour later and dive back in. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Every line of code, every soldered connection, every debugged error felt like a step closer to a better world. The final stretch was a blur of frenzied activity. The launch date was set, a mere 3 weeks away. Investors were eager, the medical community buzzing, and the media already lining up for exclusive interviews. Aethelred was housed in its own dedicated wing of our data center, a pristine, sterile environment where rows upon rows of custom-built servers, cooled by an intricate, specialized climate control system, formed the physical brain of our AI. This was no ordinary cooling system. It was a beast, designed to maintain ultra-precise temperatures, pulling in vast quantities of air through massive industrial filters and circulating it with powerful, silent fans. Mark had personally overseen its installation, boasting about its efficiency and redundancy. This thing could keep a small city block cool, he declared, wiping sweat from his brow after a particularly grueling installation day. We had completed countless subsystem tests, individual module checks, and even small-scale full-system runs. Everything had been flawless. The excitement was palpable. We were on the cusp, the very edge of making history. You could feel the hum of anticipation in the air, almost as loud as the servers themselves. We were tired, yes, but it was a good kind of tired. The kind that came from meaningful work, from pushing yourself to the very limit for something you truly believed in. There were collective moments of pride, like when Anya finally cracked a particularly complex algorithm, or when Mark managed to optimize power consumption by another tiny percentage. We were a family, forged in the crucible of ambition and exhaustion. Then came the full system stress test. The final, crucial simulation before Go-Live.it was a Tuesday afternoon, gray outside, but bright with optimism inside the data center. Henderson himself was there, along with a few key investors, their faces alight with hopeful smiles. The air was thick with expectation. I sat at the main console, my fingers hovering over the keys, ready to initiate the run. Anya was beside me, her eyes fixed on the array of monitors. Mark was doing a last-minute check on some network cables, his head disappearing behind a server rack. "All right, everyone," I announced, my voice a little shaky with excitement. "Initiating full simulation sequence." Aethelred, engage. I pressed the button. For a glorious 3 minutes, everything was perfect. The system whirred to life, a symphony of quiet power. Data streamed across the screens, green lights blinked steadily, and the temperature gauges remained firmly in the optimal zone. A collective sigh of relief, almost a cheer, rippled through the room. Henderson even clapped me on the shoulder, a rare display of open emotion from him. Then, the first alert flashed. A tiny red flicker on a secondary temperature sensor. Huh. Mark mumbled from behind the rack. That's odd. Just a momentary spike, probably. But it wasn't momentary. Another alert, then another. Bigger, bolder, critical temperature thresholds. Before anyone could react, a blaring alarm sliced through the calm. The system began to sputter. The steady hum became a ragged cough, then a strangled gasp. Red lights erupted across the entire console, flashing frantically like a digital seizure. System overheating, Anya yelled, her voice laced with panic. Emergency shutdown sequence initiated. Aethelred, our beautiful, complex creation, choked, stuttered, and then went completely dark. The sudden silence was deafening, suffocating. It felt like a punch to the gut. The air seemed to grow thick, heavy with despair. Henderson's face, moments before beaming, had gone ashen. The investors looked bewildered, then angry. What happened? Henderson demanded, his voice low but sharp, like a razor blade. Panic exploded. The team, as we jokingly called ourselves, sprang into action, but it was a chaotic, desperate energy. Mark was immediately tearing open server panels, muttering about power fluctuations. Anya was furiously typing, scrolling through reams of logs, searching for the anomaly, the bug, the single line of code that had brought us to our knees. I was right there with them, my mind racing, trying to grasp what had gone wrong. We had redundant systems, fail-safes, backups for our backups. How could it just die? We worked like madmen. The first hours were a blur of frantic energy. We checked every line of code, every hardware connection, every sensor reading. The diagnostics were clear. Aethelred was shutting down due to critical overheating. But why was it overheating? The cooling system was showing green across its own internal diagnostics. Fans were spinning, pumps were running, coolant temperatures were within spec. It made no sense. It was like saying your car was out of gas. But the fuel gauge showed full, and the pump was working. Days bled into nights. The initial shock gave way to grim determination, then to bone-deep exhaustion. We tried everything. We manually reseated every single server blade, thinking maybe a contact was loose. We recalibrated sensors. We ran stress tests on individual cooling units, proving they were working. We even tried isolating parts of the system, hoping to pinpoint a single faulty server. But no matter what, within minutes of full load, the entire system would flare up in a thermal runaway and shut down. The air in the data center started to feel charged, not with energy, but with desperation. The easy camaraderie we'd once shared frayed under the strain. Arguments broke out. Sharp words born of frustration and lack of sleep. It's a software issue. Mark would snap, his eyes bloodshot. No, it's hardware. Your cooling system isn't cutting it. Anya would retort, her voice tight with stress. Henderson was a constant, looming presence, his calls becoming more frequent, his demands sharper. Fix it now. He'd bark into the phone, the echoes carrying down the hall. We have media calls in 48 hours. Investors are pulling out. The phrase became our torture. Fix it now. It hung in the air, a constant reminder of our failure. We brought in external consultants, highly paid specialists known for their expertise in data center infrastructure and complex cooling solutions. They arrived, looking confident, with their fancy tools and their jargon. They spent hours poring over our schematics, running their own diagnostics, scratching their chins. They proposed complex theories, microfractures in coolant lines, an obscure software glitch in the cooling system's firmware, a mysterious electromagnetic interference. They hooked up more sensors, ran more tests, produced more reams of data. But no solutions. Their confidence slowly drained away. replaced by the same hollow-eyed despair that afflicted us. One famous expert, Dr. Aris, a man with 3 PhDs and a reputation for solving the unsolvable, finally threw up his hands after a particularly brutal 36-hour stint. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I have never seen anything like it. By all diagnostic measures, this system should be running perfectly. Yet, it continues to fail." His admission felt like a death knell. The official announcement of the launch delay was drafted. It sat in Henderson's inbox, a grim declaration of defeat. My heart ached. All that work, all those sacrifices, all that hope, turning to dust. I hadn't slept properly in days. My body felt like lead, my mind a murky swamp. I kept replaying every step, every decision, trying to find the one thing, the infinitesimal error that had condemned Aethelred. But there was nothing. It was like trying to catch smoke. It was the morning of what was supposed to be the public announcement of the delay. The air in the data center was thick with a defeated silence, broken only by the mournful hum of a few emergency server fans. My team members were scattered, some staring blankly at screens, others just slumped in chairs, nursing cold coffees. Mark was trying to fix a loose floor tile, anything to avoid looking at the dead servers. Anya was sketching furious diagrams on a whiteboard, trying to find a non-existent flaw. My own eyes felt gritty. My head throbbed. I had just gotten off a particularly demoralizing call with Henderson, who sounded like he'd aged 10 years in a week. I was sitting on the cold, raised floor of the server room, my back against a silent, unmoving server rack, staring at the flashing red lights of the cooling unit control panel. Every single diagnostic LED was green. Every single one. Yet, the main temperature gauges for the server clusters were glowing ominous red, and Aethelred was still dead. It was a contradiction that felt like a personal insult. A soft knock came from the main entrance of the data center. No one even looked up. Security was supposed to handle all deliveries, but they were probably as overwhelmed as we were. A moment later, a man in a rumpled brown uniform walked in, carrying a small, innocuous-looking cardboard box. He was a delivery driver, probably in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and kind, tired eyes. He looked completely out of place in our high-tech, high-stress environment, like a calm, steady tree had suddenly sprouted in the middle of a hurricane. "Delivery for Chrysalis Tech?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost shy, but clear. He held up a clipboard. "Gary, from Express Logistics. Got a box of misc hardware connectors, I think it says." I just waved vaguely in his direction. "Just put it over there," I mumbled, gesturing to an empty corner. "Someone will get to it." My mind was too preoccupied with the impossible problem. Gary nodded, walked over to the corner, and carefully placed the box down. He then looked around, taking in the scene. He saw our slumped shoulders, the discarded coffee cups, the monitors displaying error messages, the general air of defeat. He didn't say anything, didn't intrude. He just stood there, waiting patiently for his signature, a quiet observer in our personal hell. He was waiting near one of the massive cooling units, a towering, custom-built machine that spanned an entire wall, a labyrinth of ducts, fans, and filtration systems. It was the heart of our climate control. My eyes were still fixed on its control panel, the baffling green lights. Gary shifted his weight. I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound over the low hum of the few auxiliary fans we had running. It was a subtle, soft whoosh, like air being forced somewhere it shouldn't be, a phantom whisper amidst the silence. I barely registered it, dismissing it as the building settling, or just my exhausted mind playing tricks. But Gary, the delivery driver, heard it. He shifted his gaze towards the cooling unit. His head tilted slightly, like a bird listening for a worm. He moved a little closer, not touching anything, just observing. He was standing right next to a section of the main air intake duct, where the massive filters were housed. These were huge, specialized cartridges, designed to slide into place with a definitive click. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a minute or two. Then, very slowly, he turned back to me. His brow was slightly furrowed, not with judgment, but with simple curiosity. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice gentle. I looked up, annoyed by the interruption, but too weary to properly express it. "Yes? I don't mean to bother you," he continued, still quiet. "But this here." He gestured vaguely towards the cooling unit, specifically towards a large rectangular access panel on its side, where one of the filter cartridges slid in. "It just looks a little off." I scoffed internally. "Off?" We had engineers with VADS in thermodynamics, structural integrity, and fluid dynamics crawling all over this thing for days. Off was not a diagnosis they used. "What's off?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of patience. "Well," he began, not intimidated by my tone. "It's a big air intake, right? For the cooling?" I nodded curtly. "And these panels are for the filters, I'm guessing?" He pointed to the removable panel. "Yes," I confirmed, "the main intake filters. They were all installed correctly. We checked them a dozen times." "Right," he said, nodding slowly. "It's just, I used to help my uncle out on big industrial HVAC jobs when I was a kid. He always said, 'Son, air's like water. It takes the path of least resistance. And this panel, it's just not quite flush.' And I hear a little hiss, like air escaping." I stared at him, bewildered. "A little hiss? Not flush?" We were dealing with gigabytes of log files and complex thermal models, and this man was talking about a little hiss and a not quite flush panel. My first instinct was to dismiss him, to tell him we were a bit beyond basic HVAC troubleshooting. But then, a thought, cold and clear as ice water, cut through my exhaustion. What if we weren't? What if, in our desperate search for complex answers, we had completely overlooked something simple, something so blindingly obvious we couldn't see it? We had checked the fans were spinning, the sensors were working, the power was on. But had we really, truly checked the path of the air? "Show me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Gary walked over to the cooling unit, and I followed. Mark and Anya slowly turning their heads to watch, their faces etched with weary curiosity. He pointed to the corner of the large access panel that covered the main intake filter. It was almost imperceptibly ajar, perhaps by a millimeter or two, at the bottom right corner. To the casual observer, it looked closed, but Gary's eye, perhaps trained by years of moving large, precise objects, or by helping his uncle, saw it. And now that he pointed it out, I could too. It wasn't perfectly flush. And now that he mentioned it, I could hear the faint, high-pitched whistle he was talking about, just barely audible over the general background hum. It was the sound of air being pulled through a tiny gap. "It's just that," Gary said, his finger hovering near the gap. "If air can get in through here, it won't be pulled through the main filter as efficiently. It'll just short-circuit the airflow. Most of it will go through the gap instead of the filter, and then your main intake won't be pulling enough cool air, or pulling it from the right place, even if the fan's spinning full blast." My mind raced. We had checked the fans, the sensors, the power. We ran diagnostics that confirmed the fans were operating at optimal RPM. We checked the temperature of the air leaving the unit. But we hadn't considered that the air entering the unit wasn't taking the intended path. If the panel was ajar, or if the filter wasn't seated correctly, air could bypass the primary filtration and cooling stages, creating a short circuit. The fans would still be working, but they'd be largely recirculating warmer air, or pulling it inefficiently, leading to a buildup of heat that the system simply couldn't handle. It was so simple, so incredibly, terrifyingly simple. "Mark," I yelled, my voice cracking with a sudden, surging hope I hadn't felt in days. "Get over here." Mark, startled, stumbled over. I pointed to the gap. "He's right, the panel isn't flush. And listen to that hiss." Mark, the hardware wizard, squinted. His eyes, accustomed to seeing microscopic circuitry, struggled for a moment to focus on something so large and obvious. Then, he saw it. The faint gap, the almost inaudible whistle. "No way," he muttered, shaking his head. "We checked those panels a dozen times during installation. They latch in tight." "Well, check it again," I urged, my voice rising. Mark knelt down, his fingers running along the seam. He pushed gently on the panel. Nothing. He tried wiggling it. It seemed solid. It's not moving, he said, frustrated. It's latch, Gary, still standing nearby, gently interjected. Sometimes with these big ones, you gotta give them a firm tap, or they don't quite seat right, especially if something's caught in the latch, or if it got jostled. Mark scoffed, but desperation had stripped him of his usual pride. He stood up, wound back his arm, and with a grunt of exasperation, delivered a firm, open palm smack to the bottom right corner of the access panel. There was a distinct, satisfying thunk. A solid, resonant sound, like a heavy door finally locking into place. The faint whistle of escaping air vanished instantly. The panel was now perfectly flush. Silence. Stunned silence. Mark, his hand still stinging, stared at the panel as if it had personally insulted him. Then he looked at Gary, then at me, then back at the panel. His jaw hung open. It clicked, he whispered, disbelief warring with a dawning horror. It actually clicked. My heart hammered against my ribs. Could it be? Could it really be that simple? After all the high-tech diagnostics, the expert consultations, the sleepless nights, the arguments, the despair, the impending doom of a delayed launch, could it really be fixed by a single, well-placed whack from a tired engineer, guided by a delivery driver's simple observation? Try it, I told Mark, my voice trembling. Start the system. Full simulation. Mark didn't hesitate. He practically dove for the console, his fingers flying. Anya was already there, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. Initiating Aethelred, Mark announced, his voice tight. The servers whirred to life again. We held our breath. The familiar hum built, steady and strong this time. We watched the screens. The lines of code scrolled past. The network indicators flashed green. And then, the temperature gauges. They climbed slowly, steadily, then stabilized, perfectly within the optimal zone. Minutes ticked by. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15. No red lights. No overheating alerts. The system purred, strong and true, like a contented giant. Aethelred was alive. The eruption of relief was immediate, visceral. A roar went up from the small group of us in the room. We cheered. We hugged. Some of us even cried. I felt tears streaming down my face, hot and salty, a mix of exhaustion, relief, and pure, unadulterated joy. The weight, the crushing, unbearable weight of the past week, lifted instantly. It was like breathing fresh air after suffocating in a confined space for too long. In the midst of the chaos, the high fives and the whoops, I looked around for Gary. He was standing quietly by the corner where he'd left his box, a small, knowing smile on his face. He was gathering his clipboard, ready to leave, his job done. He hadn't asked for praise, hadn't revealed in the moment. He was just a delivery driver, delivering a box, and happening to notice something. I walked over to him, my legs a little shaky. Mark and Anya followed, their faces a mixture of awe and profound embarrassment. Gary, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Gary, thank you. Thank you. How did you know? He shrugged, a humble gesture. Just sounded off, ma'am. That little hiss. And I remembered what my uncle always said about air taking the path of least resistance. Sometimes when a big filter or panel doesn't quite seat, you get an air leak, and then the air doesn't pull properly through the main intake. It just sounded like what he used to talk about. Mark, the man who could diagnose a microchip with a multimeter, looked utterly humbled. We looked at every sensor, every diagnostic. We had experts in here, costing us thousands a day. No one saw it. He ran a hand through his already messy hair. We were looking for some complex software glitch, a hardware failure, anything but a loose panel. Anya, usually so composed, just shook her head. It was right there, staring us in the face. We were so caught up in the intricate details, we missed the obvious. We offered Gary a huge bonus, a company award, a personal commendation from Henderson himself, who, when he heard, was so shocked he actually laughed, then cried, then swore, then laughed again, before demanding Gary be given a lifetime supply of whatever he wanted. Gary accepted the bonus with a polite nod, but he seemed almost uncomfortable with the fuss. "Just glad I could help," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He finished signing off his delivery, gave a small wave, and quietly walked out, leaving us in a daze of relief and profound humility. He was just a regular guy, doing his job, who happened to have a lifetime of common sense and a practical understanding of how things worked in the real world. The Aethelred project launched on time, a resounding success. The news was filled with stories of its groundbreaking potential, of lives that would be saved. But in the quiet halls of Chrysalis Tech, the story that truly resonated, the one whispered with a mixture of disbelief and reverence, was about the delivery driver. That day changed me. It changed all of us. I and my brilliant, highly educated colleagues had been so deeply immersed in the complex, the theoretical, the cutting edge, that we had become blind to the simple, fundamental mechanics of the world around us. We had forgotten to look, to listen, to feel. We had relied on our elaborate tools and our intricate knowledge, overlooking the innate wisdom of someone who worked with their hands and observed the world with a different kind of intelligence. It was a profound lesson in humility. Expertise, I learned, can be a cage if it blinds you to other forms of knowledge. Sometimes the most complex problems have the simplest solutions, hidden in plain sight, waiting for an unassuming pair of eyes to notice them. The very phrase, "Fix it now," had echoed through the room with such urgency, but the fix didn't come from a frantic engineer or a highly paid consultant. It came from a man who was just doing his delivery route, who heard a sound that was off, and who wasn't afraid to speak up about it. Gary went back to his deliveries, a quiet hero in a world that rarely noticed him. But I never forgot him. His quiet observation saved Aethelred, saved our company, and maybe, just maybe, saved countless lives. More importantly, he taught me that true brilliance isn't always found in academic degrees or complex algorithms. Sometimes, it's found in the simple wisdom of a quiet delivery driver who understands how air works and isn't afraid to gently point out a slightly ajar panel. And from that day on, whenever a problem seemed insurmountable, I tried to remember Gary and ask myself, what's the obvious thing we're all missing?